All right, everybody. Welcome to another live with here at Autocrit. I'm so excited. You may have noticed. Yes, I have some headgear going on today. I haven't sprouted horns, at least I don't think so. And that is because we are in the middle of National Novel Writing Month. Yes, today is the day, the first day. And if you didn't catch our little live stream last night, we did do a little countdown towards that. And that was a lot of fun. We had a little quiz, so you should check that out. Lots of fun. But for those of you who aren't familiar with NaNoWriMo, the point of NaNoWriMo is that you want to hit 50,000 words in the month of November, which turns out to be about 1666 words a day or so. So it's fairly manageable, relatively speaking. It might seem daunting, especially for those who are newer to writing, or certainly like taking your writing, super seriously. That might seem like a lot, but there's a lot of successful writers that write a lot more than that on a regular basis. So it's definitely doable, and it's a worthy goal. It's a worthy goal to have for sure. Let me get to the next slide here. And it really is the opportunity to develop writing habits. So, it is really a tool for your benefit in order for you to see what your potential is when you're focused, when you really are dedicated towards getting a job done. And so I really recommend taking this opportunity to develop those habits, be consistent, write on a regular basis. It can really help. One thing that you can do to help yourself out is to not slow yourself down with perfectionism. Turn off that inner editor. This is the time to just push forward, get words on the page. You can always fix it in post. Turn off that inner, doubter, that skeptic inside of you. It's like, I don't know if you can do it. Now you can do it. You're going to tell yourself you can do it, and then you can go ahead and do it. But in the meantime, also, don't just trash your 50K goal with filler nonsense. Even though I don't want you to overly concern yourself with what's on the page, don't put in the laundry list, don't put in silly things, don't just blah 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 your way through. That's not going to help make you feel better about it, right? The whole point of the tool of trying to get a bunch of words on the page within a month is that you've literally created a lot of words on the page, right? So don't cheat yourself out of what you can gain out of it. Now, some people come into NaNoWriMo and they like to prep, and we helped you with that, right? We had all of our stuff about beats, and we talked about tension. So, if you've been following along this channel, you might have already had a beat sheet ready to go, hopefully so. And you could be using that for Nano. But you might be pantsing. You might just decide that, yeah, I'm just going to write a story about a mermaid that opens a Starbucks coffee under the water, and that's what I want to do. Not sure how that would work, but sure, go ahead, write that story and then just pitch your way through. The challenge with it, with something doing it like that, is that you might find there's going to be a point that you are going to get stuck. And you'll have a couple of options. One thing that you can do if you want to just kind of go with it is you just write, and you're like, I don't even care. This might be terrible. This might not make any sense, but I just want to keep going. Or, you could start a new project. There's nothing to say that 50,000 words have to be a continuous project, right? So yeah, feel free if you get a little bit stuck, be like, I'm just going to move on for now. I can trunk that. I can come back to it later. Because again, the point is keeping that momentum. Whatever's going to keep that momentum of continuous writing is what you are looking for. All right. But I wanted to, since everybody was tasked in November with NaNoWriMo and people are busy with that, I wanted to get back to the basics of what what drew us to becoming authors in the first place. What inspired us. And for most of us, it was other authors, right? And we have been inspired by so many different people throughout our life, and it has motivated us to come to the page with a certain amount of respect for what it can do, what kind of worlds it can bring for the audience, how it can inspire and entertain and all of these things. Now, to some degree, this sort of inspiration can be a little bit frightening, right? You can get that sort of imposter syndrome, like, I'm never going to be able to measure up to the greats or things like that. And what I'm going to try to do in this series that we're doing in November is to bring it down to earth a little bit. We're going to go a little bit behind the scenes, figure out some of the reasons why these authors appealed to us. And we're going to take a look under the hood. We have the wonderful writer's desk editing tool inside the Autocrat world now. And we're going to take a look under the hood and we're going to see what's going on. And we're going to get some inspiration in terms of the mechanics of what they're doing. So we're going to try to cover some of the different bases here. I would love for you to give your comments as we go through this too, and let me know specifically, what is it about some of these artists that inspired you or motivated you as you might have read them. So we're going to keep going here. The point is that everybody gets their inspiration from somewhere, right? And like I said, a lot of us get it from the great artists. But where did they get their inspiration from, right? They got it from other great artists. So again, we can sometimes approach these author greats, these icons, and we treat them with reverence, which is understandable because they are masters at their craft. But sometimes we almost feel like they came out of a vacuum, right? Like they just appeared and they just had this wonderful gift and they could just step to the page and then they could just write their beautiful stuff. And we forget the fact that no, they were actually inspired by people too, right? So going back to artists and consciously figuring out what they're doing, consciously getting inspiration from them. What I'm suggesting isn't, ripping off, isn't becoming a copycat, but just as they were inspired, we too can be inspired as well. I'm just looking at some of the comments here. If a character falls off the cliff, I can always fix it later. It is so true. It is so true. You do a rough chapter outline and then you let the characters take you where you want to go. And that makes sense. That's a pretty common tactic for that, for sure. Neil Gaiman says inspiration comes from confluence. If you ever get the opportunity to pay for his masterclass in writing, do it. Nice. Neil Gaiman is a fantastic author, of course. I found my horns. I did. Look at that. Yes. For those of you who were on last night, I was missing my horns. So I guess I can hear a lot better. I'm getting really great TV reception. That's what it is. All right. So one thing that's fun to ask ourselves is, have you ever enjoyed something and not quite known why? If you have, I often recommend artists to take a step back and ask themselves why, because it can be a very helpful exercise. What you might find out is that you're not quite clear on the answer, but sometimes if you really focus on it and you really try to analyze it, you might say, well, that's going to take the fun out of it. And, if you were just a passive viewer or a passive audience member, sure, but we're trying to be active, we're trying to be creators, right? So I would say analyze it, and you are going to figure out potentially what worked for you. That doesn't mean that's what worked for everybody, right? But then you can start to ask other people and you can say, oh, is it this that resonated with you or not? And what you'll find is a lot of times you'll see a commonality. You'll see the common themes do tend to arise, especially among works that are super famous. It's often there are certain touchstones that just really hit a lot of people. On the other hand, though, if you learn something else from somebody else, it's like, well, I really like it because of this, and they really like it because of something else. Well, that gives you a more nuanced perspective as to what's going on, and it shows you, the multiple layers of quality going on, and it's not just one simple thing that you can, that you can model yourself after. It's a lot of different things, for sure. Jim Tooley is talking about the R.J. Barker thingy trick. Yes, we had R.J. Barker on a few weeks ago, and he was talking about how in his first drafts were really awful because he would just, go as fast as he could, and he would be like, "There's the thingy and the stuff and the whatnot." And yeah, when you're trying to write quickly, that's a great thing to do. Several authors have inspired me, such as Dickens and James Cooper, contemporary authors like Mark Sullivan. Great character development. To read a journey of hopes, fears, and misbeliefs is what I love. Yes. I like that last bit. To read a journey of hopes, fears, and misbeliefs, right? So Sean is obviously somebody who's quite interested in that. I don't want to say like psychological experience, but it's that conversation about what drives us as human beings, and it really gets to the core of human existence. And that's not going to be everybody's favorite thing about a work, but I would say even among those that don't say that, they'll say, "Oh, well, I loved it because the imagination of the world building was so great." You'll find that they're still going to be affected by those other things, right? They still need those core character moments, because otherwise they probably wouldn't care much about it. And so it can help you, like I said, when you ask different people different reasons why, and you ask yourself why, and try to really get at that question. What is it about it that's resonating with me? Because that's going to help you figure out how to create a similar experience for somebody else. So today I wanted to talk about two great authors of fantasy, J.R.R. Tolkien and Brandon Sanderson. I specifically wanted to talk about them because they really are, incredibly well known, incredibly influential in their fields, but as much as they have a lot of similarities, they have a lot of differences. And I think it's interesting when we look at, even though they both have similar, epic fantasy style and epic fantasy tropes and things like that, if you look at the way that they approach the material and you see where they are similar and where they are different, it's very freeing, right? Because you can start to get the idea that, well, this is the right way to do it. And that's not true. There are multiple ways of doing things. There are multiple approaches. And that's one thing I love about the writer's desk reports that we're going to get into a little bit later, is it'll show you how different they are. And yet you can see, we know that both of them are highly successful authors, right? So again, it's not one of those one size fits all scenario, but it's helpful to know what you're doing, right? Because if you actually are knowing what you're doing and you're doing it consciously, you have more of a chance of doing it successfully. Not that you can't accidentally, stumble your way into something, but you're more likely to be successful if you're doing it on purpose. Ooh, soft magic versus hard magic. Aha! You're getting ahead of me. All right, now when it comes to Tolkien, I'm going to talk a little bit about characters. So if you've ever taken one of my classes, this chart would look familiar to you. You have a protagonist, the main character. You have the antagonist, which is the big obstacle between the main character and the antagonist. And we have the relationship character, which tells the protagonist what they need to do in order to get past the obstacle, the antagonist, right? Because if they could get past the obstacle at the beginning of the story, well, then when do they just get past it, right? So there's something they have to change. And then we have a distraction character, which represents the wrong way to go around the obstacle. Essentially, they're almost like an extra obstacle because they're telling the main character the wrong way to get past the obstacle, right? So we have these different personalities. And then in the background, not driving the story forward as much, but more the thematic characters. We have a character that's supportive, a character that is opposition. So they're kind of like the big skeptic, the big critic, and then we have like the cheerleader. And then we usually have a character that embodies emotion and embodies reason. So if we look at the Fellowship of the Ring here, and we look at these characters, I'm going to like sort them really quick. Yes. So what I have here, actually, let me shrink this down a little bit because my name is hiding some of it. And I'll put myself in the middle. It's hard to make myself fit with these horns. It's a challenge. It's like the people that have the people with big hair and they have to figure out like how to frame a shot. All right, so Frodo, of course, is the protagonist. The antagonist is really Sauron, but I have the ring wraiths there as a representation because there's multiple characters that kind of form that central force, right? But Sauron is at the center of it. And then Gandalf is the relationship character that tells Frodo what he needs to do. Now, I have the ring as the personification of the wrong thing to do, right? The wrong thing would be to fall into temptation to use power, right? Because one of the big themes of the Lord of the Rings is basically the old adage of absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? So the ring is that personification of that sentiment. And the fact that it's just always around, it's that really powerful symbol. I think that's one reason why the work has resonated so well. I mean, there's so many reasons, but of course, that's just such a wonderful artistic way of expressing that thought. And it's a thought that we often think about in terms of how much power should we really have, how much power could be given to us before it would corrupt us, and we ask those sort of questions. And so the fact that Tolkien gets at the root of those basic human questions really makes it resonate beyond just the fact that, oh, there's cool stuff going on, and look, there's little people, and there's magic and all that, and I don't want to sound like I'm patronizing that. I love imagination, but I'm just saying, it's not just as simple as that. Of course, it gets at the root of a lot of basic human truth. So support characters, you have Sam, who's the sidekick. He's along for the ride. You have Aragorn, who's the reason character. Boromir is the opposition. He's like the big skeptic. He's big obstacle. And Gimli is the emotion character. This is specifically thinking of Fellowship of the Ring, by the way, not just the whole series. Really, once you get past Fellowship of the Ring, Tolkien splits them into two parties, and you really have to look at them as almost two separate stories in many ways. But, you can see how Tolkien has fulfilled all of those basic all those basic roles in the story, and it really fleshes out the cast. It creates a strong world. They call it the story mind sometimes, and you get all those different viewpoints, so it feels like a real situation. Because when you have all the different characters represent all the different types, what you're doing is you're representing all the diverse viewpoints about how to specifically tackle that problem, right? And so it makes the problem feel quite realistic because you're seeing all those different ways of viewing it. All right, so magic systems. Yes, we were talking about magic systems. Somebody mentioned them. One of the biggest differences between Tolkien and Brandon Sanderson are their magic systems and how they deal with them. And neither, it's not like one does it right and one does it wrong. It really depends on what it is that you're trying to do. Now, in the fantasy world, and this is really applicable to anything. So let's say you're not really a fantasy reader. This is applicable to anything in that the world building you do, those imaginative elements, either whether it be technology or if it's horror, it's some of the more, the fantastical elements or supernatural elements, right? You have to ask yourself, does the audience really understand that much about all of this stuff? Or is it above them? Is it this otherworldly thing and it's just, it's essentially, it's just magic. I don't have to explain it. I don't have to go into any detail about it, and I actually don't want to. That'll remove some of the wonder and the excitement of all of it. So Lord of the Rings takes that kind of wondrous approach, right? Gandalf's magic is fantastic and it's beyond our comprehension. And when he shows up, you're never quite sure exactly what his limitations are, what he can do. Now, Tolkien is very smart at the very beginning of the story because he puts the limits on Gandalf where he says, I can't take the ring because I would be I might succumb to it, right? And that's a great thing to do because otherwise, it might make it seem like, well, why doesn't Gandalf just do everything, right? So he gives him a little bit of limitations, but you don't really understand at any given moment exactly what the rules are. Gandalf is above us, and it makes him very mysterious, very wondrous, right? On the other hand, Brandon Sanderson treats his magic system much more like a chess tournament, where we understand a lot more of the rules of what the pieces can do, and we can track them, and it's a much more complicated system. Now, this is a great thing to do because while the story unfolds at any given moment, we can watch it almost like a sporting match, right? When we can say, oh, okay, well, if this character is this, and this character is this, or if this comes about, we can follow along. I often say the difference between, a hard magic system, a soft magic system is, in a hard magic system, it's like you're watching a sporting event. You understand all the rules of the game, and you can root for the teams, and you can start to figure out potentially like who's going to win and all that sort of stuff and strategy. Whereas a soft magic system is more of, wow, look at that athletic prowess, and that's basically all you got. And I will say, you will notice that stories that tend to have more magic in them tend to go more into the hard magic system, because the more of the fireworks you have, the more fatiguing it can get. I mean, have you ever watched like a 30-minute fireworks show that didn't have a lot of, that was just kind of like random fireworks, didn't like have a lot of storytelling or a good pacing? You probably got a little bored after a while. I mean, even with good pacing, I mean, there comes a point where that sort of stuff can get fatiguing. So if you want to avoid that, and this is true again for anything, so this is true for any sort of world building. If you are doing something with advanced technology, or if you have some sort of creature that's attacking people, or there's ghosts or whatever, the more involved they are in the story, the more involved those elements are in the story, and the more invested you want the audience to be, the more the audience really needs to understand kind of what's going on. Now, you obviously can't explain everything away. There's a certain point where you just have to say, yeah, that's just how it works, right? It's like any sort of limitation in magic. You say, oh, well, they can make things fly, but they can only make things fly after drinking orange juice. And you don't have to explain why that's the case, right? But because you've explained that limitation, well, now we have in the back of their mind, it's like, well, I don't know. Are they going to be able to get orange juice? Do they have it in this area? Do they have to carry it on them all the time? And you start to strategize about the next steps. So that's a big content difference between Brandon Sanderson and Tolkien, is the fact that Tolkien really went with this wondrous view of magic, and Brandon Sanderson went with a little bit more of a very actually quite influenced by the way that tabletop games and things like that have got much more strategic. And that's very smart. Move with the times, move with the culture. Audience expectations do change. Now, when it comes to the specific writing styles, we can see some differences as well. And in order to explore that fully, I am going to bring up our writer desk here. And I'm going to take a look around at some of these authors from a do a little analytics of it. This is like a little mini what's the score here. So I have here J.R.R. Tolkien's I'm going to take off my hat just for a moment. I know, it's like I lost 10 pounds. And I'm going to make myself a little bit smaller so you can see screen better. We are comparing right now to general fiction. So this is how Tolkien compares to just the generic realm of authors, right? So we can see pacing is a little bit slower. Also, the word choice is a little bit low. And I think one of the reasons why it's like that is because Tolkien's style is that third person omniscient, right? And so he does fall into places where a system like such as ours is going to find a lot more of that kind of telling versus showing, right? Because that's just the rhetorical style of his work. Now, that does make him a little bit different than a modern author for sure, which is one reason why it's a little bit off. But on the other hand, it's like, is that a bad thing? No, that's the rhetorical style that he chose. You can see that 12% of Tolkien's paragraphs are considered slow-paced. That's pretty slow. And that's something that we're going to see a big difference of between him and Brandon Sanderson. Just watch. The average words per paragraph's a little bit longer, of course, because that's slow. The average words per sentence, though, is about the same. So the way that Tolkien gets there is by just having more sentences in his paragraphs. So sentence length is not much longer, which is one reason why he still is quite readable, because paragraphs are a more subtle thing that you can do to pull the reader through the page. That sentence length can really bog down a reader in a hurry. But Tolkien is well within the normal, as it were. He does have less dialogue than we find typically in fiction. Not particularly. That's not particularly surprising to me, knowing the work. There's a lot of description going on, a lot of world building going on, so there's less time for that. The tagging is very similar. Tolkien does not use a lot of adverbs in his dialogue. So apparently he was ahead of Stephen King on that memo. But he does not have a lot of additional, they said boldly or they said loudly or something like that. That's just not something that Tolkien does very much. In fact, quite low, which interesting. We generally recommend that you don't do as much of that because you can find that to be a crutch, right? When you're writing and you have to add that extra adverb. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean that you weren't telling it strongly enough in the dialogue itself? Perhaps not, perhaps not. And like I said, the showing versus telling is a little bit higher. And also the filler words is a little bit higher. And again, this is because of that rhetorical style. It's because The Lord of the Rings has that feeling like somebody sitting you down and telling you a story. And so in comparison to some, especially more modern works where the third the third person POV tends to be quite detached and almost clinical. That's not what Tolkien was going for. So you can see the difference there. So that would be something to keep in mind, right? If you that's something that you actually liked, you liked about it, you like that sort of that sort of narrative style. Keep that in mind when you're running reports such as this, or when you're writing that you don't necessarily have to follow all that advice about the way you should write, as it were, because perhaps you're doing it intentionally, right? And of course, if you went into the writer's desk and you wanted to, you could actually make yourself compare to Tolkien. Oh, by the way, in case it wasn't clear, I'm using Tolkien's writing to analyze. So even though it says me, and has my picture, I put in Tolkien's work in order to do this analyzing. So yeah, so. The major words we see are encouragement and fear. That's not a big surprise. It's an adventure story, so you got to have the push to get going, and then you also have the fear of the consequences. You also notice forbidden is very high, and of course that's because of all of those words that deal with the ring and that forbidden power, right? So even subtextually, Tolkien is including a lot of that in his writing, which is very clever, and it creates the mood that he's going for. Sentence starters. Tolkien does start a lot more sentences with ing verbs and conjunctions. And again, I think that's that conversational style, that narrative style that he's going for, which is why that's a little bit higher. And generic descriptions a little bit higher, again, because it feels a little more conversational than it might otherwise. But we were talking about Brandon Sanderson in comparison to Tolkien, right? What are the differences? So I went ahead and I compared the two. So now who I am in this version, if you see my score, I am Brandon Sanderson, and I'm comparing him directly against Tolkien. And what we see is that while Tolkien was quite similar to regular general fiction, 82, quite normal. Tolkien and Brandon Sanderson vary quite a bit. And one of the biggest places where they vary is this pacing and momentum. Look at that. Quite low, right? And that's because I was talking about Tolkien and his 2%, or no, sorry, and his 12% slow-paced paragraphs. Well, let's take a look at Brandon Sanderson. Less than 1% of his paragraphs are slow-paced. He writes very differently in terms of that, right? In terms of that choice. He has a lot of white space. Now, if you think about Brandon Sanderson has a reputation, well-deserved, for writing dense works that are, packed with content, they're rich, and they're long, right? Um, and that's all a great thing. People are like, oh, if I'm going to use my Audible credit, I'm going to use it on Brandon Sanderson. I get hours of material, right? But one way that he, I think, makes it more digestible for the audience is he really thinks about that white space. And so he pulls you through. And the goal is like, oh, you've read and read and read. And then you pick yourself up and you're like, whoa, I read a whole bunch of pages, didn't I? And it was because along the way, it was very easy to digest with those slower paragraphs. It really picks up the pacing. So I'm going to catch up with some of these comments just to make sure I've okay, I caught up with the comments. You're always so great with your comments. I want to make sure I don't miss anything. Okay, so the average words per paragraph. Look at that. It's like half, right? So again, it's not different content, really. It's just how he's breaking it up, right? That's just a mechanical thing to do. Now, one thing that we've learned and we've gotten battered in our brains, from middle school is like a paragraph, it has a main idea and it has supporting sentences. And of course, in prose writing, that's complete baloney. It's done for rhythm. It's done to indicate to the audience how to read it through. It's way more subjective. It's not some sort of, well, my paragraphs must include this and that and the other thing. And breaking up your paragraphs, especially if you want to copy a more modern style like Brandon Sanderson, will help you, like I said, lead the audience through, and they're going to absorb your book. It won't look as peculiar. One thing you'll notice, unfortunately, with self-published books is they'll overlook this a lot. And so you'll open it up and you just get this block of text and you're like, ugh. And honestly, the same content with just being broken up would be so much better. Right. So that's an industry norm that you don't necessarily want to buck. Now, you'll notice the average words per sentence. Brandon Sanderson does write shorter sentences than on average. Remember, we saw that with Tolkien, he was about normal. 11 was pretty normal. 12. Brandon Sanderson is a bit shorter. So not only does he write shorter paragraphs, he also does write slightly shorter sentences. And again, I think that's to lead you through the story. We all know that Brandon Sanderson isn't at a loss for words, and he has a lot of content to go through. But I think going through it at a quicker rate makes that journey a lot more palatable. And, it's one of those things, too, that I don't know if Brandon Sanderson really sat down one day and it's like, well, I'm going to write shorter sentences. It could be that, just organically developed and that's what felt right to him. And now we can observe it on the other side, which is really fun. Now, dialogue, this is another thing you can see the difference in the era, in my opinion, almost more than anything else, is that you can look at and see how much more dialogue Brandon Sanderson has versus Tolkien. But Brandon Sanderson does have a fair amount of dialogue just in general. And again, I think this comes from the influence of a lot of modern authors are influenced from movies and other mediums that are very dialogue heavy. And I do think books in general have moved in a more dialogue heavy direction. But this is something that you might want to keep in mind, when you're doing your own work. You want to ask yourself, what percentage of dialogue do I want? Right. And it's a helpful thing to ask because it does change the tone and feel of the piece when you have that much dialogue, right? Because what that means is there's less time that you're spending just kind of explaining what's going on, world building, talking about external forces, action, excuse me, or you've decided to put a lot more of that in dialogue. And people do tend to do that because exposition can be easier to write in dialogue. One thing to keep in mind with Tolkien is that because his voice is so narrative, in some ways it feels a little bit like dialogue itself. And so I think that does kind of blur the line of the difference, right? That third person narrator has that sort of tone to some extent as well. I'm just looking here. I remember the arguments with my English teachers in school, then telling them to follow the rules, me ignoring them accusing me of witchcraft, me trying to write novels before I had the skill. That's pretty much everybody's process, right? You get told by teachers that are not creative writers, that are like trying to train you to, write academic papers or something, and then you're like, that's not very interesting, I could do it so much more interesting. And then you do it, and then you work on your own projects, and then you're like, oh well, some of what they said was true, but on the other hand, I also need to learn all of these other things, and yeah, it's a fun process. Was told when I became famous I could break the writing rules, but not until then. But see, I think what you find is a lot of these quote unquote rules are, it's like the Pirates of the Caribbean, right? They're more like guidelines, right? They are typical ways of writing and they work, generally speaking, for a reason. So when you know that you're violating that general norm, then you know, oh, I'm violating the general norm. Do I have a good reason to do it? And if you don't, then it's like, well, maybe I should just go back to the comfort, especially when you're a newer author. That makes a lot of sense. Shorter sentences, yes. I also prefer shorter paragraphs and shorter chapters. Personal preference. Yes, chapter length is something that generally has gotten shorter over the years too. I mean, you pick up one of those airport novels, and it's like a chapter could be like 3 pages. It feels like it's like 70 chapters. And one of the reasons why they do that, again, it's just a psychological effect to pull you through the story, and things like that. Find you a Stephen King book that doesn't have a single adverb. That's impossible. And in fact, we will be discussing Stephen King in one of the upcoming episodes of this, and we're going to find out how much Stephen King follows his own advice about adverbs, and you might find it rather interesting. Okay. Adverbs in dialogue. Adverb tags. Tolkien had almost none. Brandon Sanderson has a lot. Quite a lot. And again, that's a choice, right? Perhaps it's because of a lot of volume things like softly or gently or something like that. But there's nothing wrong with it. It's a stylistic choice. You might decide that you want it. He also has a lot more adverbs. Look at that. Double the adverbs. Interesting, right? Um, uh, Again, it could be that there's a lot more things involving time. There's a lot more, they did it then, they're doing it later. So those adverbs, of course, are going to be justified. But it does seem like he throws in more adverbs. He's not as much of an adverb killer as some authors, which is why, again, anytime you hear a piece of advice, you got to ask yourself, does it fit for you? You might find an author that you really love, go into the writer's desk and be like, hey, you know what? He actually use a fair amount of adverbs. Maybe I'll kind of, look to them for advice on this because I like their groove. I like their way they do things, and so on and so forth. I'm just gonna scroll down here really quick here. Again, just like Tolkien, we have similar word emotions going on. We have encouragement, and fear, which makes sense because, again, Brandon Sanderson writes these epic stories, adventure stories, hero journey stories. What you'll notice, though, is that forbidden is much lower and greed is much higher. Now, the work I was comparing to here was Mistborn, and that would make sense considering there's a lot of talk about, attaining things. And so it's not as much of a story about the power that you shouldn't have kind of thing, right? It's a different sort of thing. It's more of a heist story. So you would expect greed would be higher. And of course, indeed it is. So there we go. We find exactly what we would expect. Sentence starters, you'll notice that unlike Tolkien, who does it a lot more than normal, Brandon Sanderson does it quite a bit less. He does not like starting his sentences like that. And that gives a certain rhythm to his work. I think one reason why he probably doesn't need to do it as much, again, it's those shorter paragraphs. That would indicate that he's switching topics more often. And so he doesn't need to switch his sentence. He doesn't need to vary his sentences as much because he doesn't need to approach the same thing in multiple different ways in the same manner, right? There's more ways of starting sentences in different ways without having to go to those words. It's speculation. I didn't do a super deep dive on that, but that would be my speculation looking at those high-end numbers there. Now, I'm going to do one final look because I wanted to look again at that pacing, right? So when you look at the pacing of Tolkien, you can see these are highlighted paragraphs that are considered on the slow end. And yeah, you can see, especially at first, this beginning is quite slow as it explains all about hobbits. Now, this is the sort of thing that when you are a newer author, you might have read, works like this from Tolkien, and you might say, oh, well, I'm going to totally just, throw my hat in the ring and do it just like that. And that might be a big mistake, because while people were accepting that of Tolkien, and Tolkien kind of comes in with that reputation, somebody was talking about how you can break rules when you're famous, right? It's kind of a rule now that you don't want to start with that many slow-paced paragraphs, right? And just because Tolkien got away with it, I wouldn't assume that you could get away with it. And you might want to ask yourself, if you're really trying to resemble a story that was written back in the 1950s, or if you want to try to resemble what is, hot and popular today. Somebody was saying that the comparison was interesting because Tolkien was from 1954 and he was also academic. I mean, that was partly the reason, right? I wanted to pick two very different authors. That's not always going to be the case in this series, okay? So don't expect that it's going to be quite that dramatic. I just wanted to show, because people can feel like, oh, well, if I'm going to write epic fantasy, I have to do this, right? And I showed you that there were two majorly different approaches in those writing styles, and they both were tremendously successful. That was essentially what I was doing there. It would be cool to compare J.R.R. Martin and Robert Jordan. Nice. Maybe we'll do that sometime, right? I love these comparisons. We're going to do some more of them. I'm going to switch genres next week, though, away from fantasy. But yeah, if you have any other suggestions of other matchups you'd want to see, we could bring it in. It's like right fight or something, What's the right way to write? What do they say? I don't know. I'm getting a little crazy. Okay. Now we have so many exciting things going on in AutoCrit, as you will have just noticed there. Our writer's desk, our editor, has completely been rehauled from top to bottom, and it's beautiful. It's gorgeous. You can sign in and you can check it out for yourself. If you're not familiar with the way that our new hub system sets up, you're going to find it under the writer's desk. That's where it lives. Will I be comparing romance writers? Perhaps I will. Now, we have other great events coming up this month. We do have a Making a Hero workshop. I will be presenting that. And we're going to go through characters. While you're writing your NaNoWriMo novel, you might get to the point where you're like, I want to make sure that my main character is solid, that my main character is everything they need to be. Well, you can join the Making a Hero workshop, and we'll talk about it. We'll talk about how to make your main character likable, even if you have an anti-hero, how to pull that off, different ways of creating personality quirks without getting annoying, and so on and so forth. And of course, we're not going to leave out the antagonists or villains, right? And we will be discussing that. What is the difference between an antagonist and a villain? They're not the same thing, really. And how to make them work. A lot of people don't want to fall into the Snidely Whiplash, the sort of villain. On the other hand, you don't want a character that's just completely bland, or just seems to be kind of in the way for no good reason, or isn't a good foil for the main character. So we will go ahead and, we got a bot. Gonna bot that. Okay. I've been discovered. I summoned them with my hero workshop. But the villain, we're going to just make sure that your villains are up to the level that they need to be in order to make your work as great as possible. So both of those are currently available on autocrit.com. You can find them by going over to the Academy page. And actually, hold on. I can show you. It's kind of fun, right? Because the new AutoCrit is so exciting. I'm excited. So in the new AutoCrit world, yeah, if you want to find all of these courses, including courses that you've taken in the past, you're going to want to go to the Academy, and that's where you'll find all of our courses. And currently, we have quite a few. We have Beyond Reality, Nightmare Fuel, Story Sorcery. We have a new writing Gothic fiction course, which is amazing, done by Rain Hall. She takes you through creepy old buildings in her area. It's a lot of fun. It looks like something out of the Blair Witch Project. And yes, those 2 workshops that are coming up later this month. So yeah, just browse on over to autocrit.com and check it out, and I'll be looking forward to seeing you there. In the meantime, though, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell for this YouTube channel, because next week we will be bringing in another pair of authors that inspire us and look at some of what goes on underneath the hood, some of their particular characteristics, and find out more and get it more inspired. And of course, I'll want to hear all of your updates for NaNoWriMo. I'll go ahead and put the hat back on here. There we go. Ta-da! Yes, NaNoWriMo. And I feel like I like blended in the background there. And we'll see you there. So in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us here on YouTube, and I'll see you around the AutoCrit community. Bye, everybody!